My son told me about the old man in the elevator on a Tuesday evening. The kind of evening that feels so ordinary it barely leaves a mark in memory. Which is perhaps why the moment still haunts me now, because nothing that terrible should ever begin so quietly. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the small one near the window that looked out over the courtyard, where the lights flickered unevenly and the snow never seemed to fully melt. I was half listening, half scrolling through messages on my phone, nodding automatically as my son talked about school, about a broken pencil, about how his teacher smelled like oranges. Then he said, with the same casual tone, that he had made a new friend. I looked up, smiling, already preparing the usual questions, asking for a name, an age, a classroom, something normal. He swung his legs under the chair and said it was a dedushka from the elevator, an old man who rode with him sometimes when he went downstairs. Something in the way he said it made my smile pause, not disappear, just freeze slightly, like a crack forming in glass. I asked him which neighbor he meant, because our building had many residents and I did not know all of them. And my son shook his head and said the old man did not live in any apartment. He lives in the elevator, he explained patiently, as if correcting a foolish adult. I laughed, because parents laugh when children say strange things, because laughter is easier than fear, and told him that elevators do not have residents. My son frowned at me, offended not by my disbelief, but by my misunderstanding. He said the old man was always there, just not for everyone. That night, after I put him to bed and turned off the light, I stood in the hallway longer than usual, listening to the quiet hum of the building, the distant clang of pipes, the soft mechanical breathing of the elevator somewhere behind the walls. I told myself that children invent companions, that imagination fills gaps adults have learned to ignore, and that there was nothing unusual in an old man striking up conversation with a child in a shared space. Still, when I lay down to sleep, I dreamed of doors opening and closing without anyone inside. Over the next few days, the old man became a regular presence in our conversations, slipping into them as naturally as weather or homework. My son said the old man liked to stand very still, leaning on a cane he did not really need. He said the old man smelled like metal and cold air. He said the old man knew which floor the elevator would stop at before any button was pressed. I asked, more carefully now, if anyone else ever rode with them, and my son shrugged and said sometimes people were there, but they never noticed the old man, and the old man preferred it that way. He does not like to be looked at by people who are still busy living, my son said, repeating words that did not sound like his own. That was the first time I felt something sink in my chest, slow and heavy. I checked the building's resident list that evening, pulling up the outdated PDF from the management website and comparing it with the printed notice near the mailboxes. I scanned every name, every apartment number, every age bracket. There were a few elderly tenants, yes, but none matched the description my son gave so consistently. None who lived alone without visitors. None who had ever been mentioned in hallway conversations or complained about noise or forgotten trash. I told myself it meant nothing. Buildings forget people. Lists are wrong. Memory is unreliable. Still, the next time we entered the elevator together, I found myself watching the mirror instead of the floor indicator, waiting for something I could not define. The ride passed uneventfully, just the two of us, the soft buzz of cables and the faint reflection of fluorescent light. When we reached the ground floor, my son hesitated before stepping out, looking back into the empty space behind us. He waved. I asked him who he was saying goodbye to, and he looked at me with mild surprise, as if the answer were obvious, and said, "The old man, of course, because it is polite." I scolded him gently for playing games, but my voice sounded wrong to my own ears, too thin, too quick. That night, He asked me why adults pretend not to see the people who have nowhere else to go. I did not know how to answer that question, so I kissed his forehead and told him to sleep. The changes in my son were subtle at first, the kind of things you might attribute to growing up or seasonal moods. He became quieter, more observant, as if listening to something beneath conversations. He stopped rushing out of the elevator when we arrived, preferring to stand still for a second longer, his hand hovering near the buttons. Once, I caught him whispering numbers under his breath, counting floors that did not correspond to our building. I asked him what the old man talked about, trying to keep my tone light, and my son said the old man liked stories about waiting, about how waiting changes people, about how time feels different when you are not sure where you belong anymore. He said the old man told him that elevators are honest places because they always show you exactly where you are between where you were and where you are going. I began avoiding the elevator when I could, taking the stairs even when my legs protested, even when my son complained. But children notice patterns, and one evening he asked me why I was afraid of the elevator. I told him I was not afraid, just tired. He nodded slowly, the way the old man does, he said. That night, something happened that finally pushed me past denial. I woke up to the sound of the elevator bell ringing, once, twice, again and again, echoing faintly through the building like a distant heartbeat. I checked the time. It was far too late for normal traffic. I went to the hallway and opened our apartment door a crack, peering out. The corridor was empty, but the elevator indicator at the end of the hall glowed softly, flickering between floors, moving without stopping, as if someone were riding it endlessly up and down. I stood there longer than I should have, my hand numb on the doorframe, until the bell finally fell silent and the indicator went dark. In the morning, my son told me the old man had been upset. He said the old man did not like being ignored. When I asked ignored by whom, my son smiled, small and secretive, and said, "Adults always think silence protects them." I contacted the concierge that afternoon, an elderly woman who had worked in the building longer than anyone could remember. I described the old man carefully, watching her face for recognition, for confusion, for anything at all. She listened politely, then shook her head and said no one like that lived here now. When I asked if anyone ever had, her eyes flickered for just a moment, and she said many people had lived and died in this building, and it was best not to dwell on those who did not leave much behind. I asked about the elevator, about accidents, about repairs. She told me it had always been unreliable. That evening, as we stepped into the elevator, my son took my hand unexpectedly tight. He whispered that the old man was happy now, because I had finally started asking the right questions. The doors closed with a soft, final sound. And for a brief second, before the elevator began to move, I felt a presence beside us, close enough that the air seemed to thicken, cold and heavy, as if something invisible were breathing slowly, patiently, waiting to be acknowledged. The elevator lurched upward with a movement so gentle it almost felt imagined. Yet my hand tightened around my son's instinctively, my body reacting before my mind could construct a rational explanation for the sudden chill that crawled up my spine. The fluorescent light above us flickered once, twice, then steadied, bathing the metal walls in a pale glow that made every reflection look slightly wrong, as if the elevator were a poor copy of itself. My son did not look afraid. That frightened me more than anything else. He stood very still, his shoulders relaxed, his gaze fixed somewhere just to my right, at a height that suggested a person taller than him, but shorter than me. I followed his eyes without meaning to, staring into empty space, my breath catching as my reflection warped across the brushed steel. "Say hello," my son whispered. I did not answer. My mouth felt dry, my tongue heavy, as though language itself had decided not to cooperate. The elevator passed the second floor without stopping, then the third, then the fourth, moving steadily upward, though I was certain I had pressed the button for the ground floor. I forced myself to speak, to break the silence before it swallowed us whole. "There's no one here," I said, and immediately hated how small my voice sounded. The air shifted beside me, not in a dramatic way, not with the rush of movement or sound, but with a subtle pressure, like someone leaning closer without touching. I smelled it then, faint but unmistakable. The scent of cold metal left too long in winter air. My son smiled. "He says you always say that at first," he murmured. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain the old man could hear it, whoever or whatever he was. I pressed the emergency stop, my finger trembling, but nothing happened. The button remained dark, unresponsive, as if it were no more than a decoration. The elevator continued to rise. "You should listen," my son said softly. "He waited a long time for someone like you." The words struck something deep inside me, a buried nerve of guilt I had never fully acknowledged, the kind that grows quietly in adults who move through life too quickly, ignoring the spaces between moments. I had the absurd urge to apologize, though I did not know to whom. The elevator finally slowed and stopped between floors, jolting us just enough to make my son stumble slightly. I reached out to steady him, and for the briefest instant, my hand brushed against something else, something solid and cold, shaped like a sleeve. I recoiled, my breath tearing out of my chest. A sound emerged from beside us then, low and rough, like air scraping over rusted metal. It was not loud, but it carried weight, filling the small space until there was no room for denial. "You see," the voice said, and though it spoke in simple words, there was something ancient in the cadence, something tired. "It is easier when you stop pretending." I pressed my back against the wall, pulling my son closer, though he did not resist, did not cling to me the way I expected. Instead, he leaned slightly toward the voice, attentive, respectful. "What do you want?" I demanded, anger flaring hot and sudden, a desperate shield against the creeping fear. "Leave my son alone." The voice paused, as if considering me. "I never wanted him," it said. "Children are only messengers. They still hear the building breathe." The elevator lights dimmed, then brightened again, and in the shifting reflection, I thought I saw a shape beside us, a suggestion of a hunched figure, the outline of a cane touching the floor without sound. "What do you want from me?" I asked again, my voice cracking despite my efforts. "To be remembered," the voice replied, "and to be relieved." The words settled heavily in the air, its meaning stretching beyond comfort. My son finally looked up at me then, his eyes serious, older than they had any right to be. "He's been stuck for a very long time," he said. "He says people forget faster than machines." The elevator shuddered, a deep vibration running through the walls and into my bones, and I realized with a sick certainty that we were not going anywhere until something was resolved, something I did not yet understand. When the doors finally opened, it was not onto any floor I recognized. Instead of our familiar corridor, there was darkness, broken only by a thin strip of flickering light far above, like a ceiling too distant to reach. The smell of dust and oil flooded in, thick and stale, carrying with it the unmistakable sense of abandonment. My son took a step forward, curious, unafraid, and I grabbed his jacket, pulling him back sharply. "No," I said. "We are not going out there." The old man's presence shifted, and for the first time, I sensed something like amusement. "He will not come," the voice said calmly. "He is not ready." A pause. "But you are." My son turned toward me, his expression gentle, almost apologetic. "He says you noticed," he told me. "Most people do not." Memories rushed at me then, unbidden, of moments I had dismissed. The flicker of lights I ignored. The elevator rides I rushed through with my eyes on my phone. The nameless faces I passed every day without seeing. I felt exposed, measured against some unseen scale. "I do not understand," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. "You do not need to," the old man replied. "You only need to listen." The darkness beyond the doors seemed to pulse, and in it, I glimpsed movement. Shadows layered over shadows, like impressions left by people who had passed through and never quite left. A cold certainty settled in my chest as understanding dawned, slow and terrible. "You died here," I said. "Yes," the old man answered simply. The word echoed, heavier than silence. He told me then, not in a rush, not with drama, but with the weary patience of someone who had repeated the story countless times to no one at all. He spoke of a malfunction, of being trapped between floors, of calling for help that never came because it was late and everyone was asleep, and the building had learned to ignore small sounds. He spoke of time stretching thin, of hunger and fear giving way to numbness, of dying unnoticed in a place designed to move people along quickly. "They fixed the elevator," he said. "They forgot the man." My throat tightened painfully. I imagined the search reports that never happened, the missing notices never printed, the quiet assumption that an elderly man living alone had simply vanished without consequence. "I do not know what you expect me to do," I said. The old man's presence leaned closer, and this time I did not pull away. "You already began," he said. "You asked questions. You listened. You let your son speak when it frightened you." The elevator trembled again, the darkness beyond the doors receding slightly, as if waiting. "He needs someone to take his place," my son said quietly. The words hit me like a physical blow. "No," I said immediately. "Absolutely not." The old man did not argue. He did not threaten. He simply waited. And in that waiting, I felt the full weight of his patience, forged over years of being unseen. "He does not mean forever," my son added quickly. "Just long enough." "Long enough for what?" I demanded. "For someone else to notice," he replied. The elevator lights flickered violently now, alarms beginning to wail somewhere deep in the machinery, though the sound felt distant, muffled, as if filtered through water. I imagined headlines, investigations, my son waiting for me, confused, frightened, growing up with unanswered questions. I looked at my child. I really looked at him, and saw the fragile line between innocence and understanding. He saw how close he stood to a world I could no longer protect him from entirely. "You promised," I whispered to myself. A promise I had never spoken aloud but had always carried. The old man's voice softened. "He will be safe," he said. "He already is." I closed my eyes, breathing in the cold air, the scent of metal and dust, and made a decision I knew would haunt me regardless of the outcome. "Let him go," I said. "Let my son leave." The elevator doors shuddered, and then began to close slowly, the darkness retreating as the familiar corridor came back into view. My son looked at me, confusion and fear finally flickering across his face. "Dad?" he asked. I knelt, gripping his shoulders, forcing a smile that felt like it might tear my face apart. "Go home," I said. "I'll be right behind you." The doors slid shut between us, sealing his small figure on the other side, his hand raised, pressing against the glass as the elevator began to move again, this time without him. I was alone. The old man stood beside me now, no longer invisible, his form solid and unmistakable in the reflection, his eyes deep and tired, and filled with something like gratitude. "Thank you," he said. The elevator descended into darkness. The elevator moved without sound, without the familiar whine of cables or the rhythmic clack of passing floors, descending instead through a silence so complete it pressed against my ears until I felt dizzy. The walls no longer reflected light properly, their metallic surface dull and uneven, as if time itself had begun to corrode them from the inside. I stood where my son had been moments before, my hand still raised, fingers curled as though I could reach through closed doors and pull him back. The old man stood beside me, fully visible now, no longer a suggestion or a chill in the air, but a hunched figure in a worn coat that seemed too thin for any season. His face was pale, his skin stretched tight over sharp bones, and his eyes were the most unsettling thing of all, not because they were empty, but because they were full of awareness, the kind that comes only after a very long time spent watching without being seen. "You will not be harmed," he said, as if reading the thoughts unraveling in my head. "Not yet." I swallowed, forcing myself to breathe slowly, deliberately, the way you do when panic threatens to take control. "You said long enough," I replied. "Define long enough." He tilted his head slightly, considering the question. "Until someone notices," he repeated. "Until the building remembers that it can still fail." The elevator slowed, and then stopped with a soft, almost tender jolt. The doors opened onto a narrow space filled with darkness and the oppressive smell of old dust, oil, and something faintly organic, like decay long stripped of its urgency. This was not a floor meant for living people. There were no numbers, no signs, no clean lines of human intention. Just cables stretching upward into blackness and downward beyond sight, and walls scarred by time and neglect. "This is where you were," I said quietly. "Yes," the old man answered, "and where I stayed." The doors closed behind us with a finality that made my chest ache. I realized then that I had crossed a boundary not marked by any visible line, a threshold between movement and stillness, between those who pass through and those who are left behind. Time behaved strangely there. I could not say how long we stood in that in-between place, listening to the building's distant groans, feeling vibrations ripple through the floor like the slow breathing of something immense and indifferent. The old man did not speak again for a long while, and I did not press him, afraid that words might make the situation more real than it already was. Eventually, I asked the question that had been circling my thoughts since the moment the doors had closed on my son. "Why me?" He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something like regret flicker across his face. "Because you noticed," he said simply, "and because you were afraid." "That does not make me special," I snapped, the frustration finally breaking through. "That makes me human." He nodded slowly. "Exactly." He explained then, in the same calm, patient tone, that buildings like ours collect echoes, not just of sound, but of attention and neglect. Most people move through them quickly, focused on destinations, not transitions. Elevators, he said, are especially vulnerable places, suspended between intent and arrival, places where people are briefly forced to acknowledge waiting. When I died, he continued, the waiting never ended. At first, he had screamed, pounded on the doors, clawed at the walls until his fingers bled. Later, he had whispered, then prayed, then finally listened. Over time, he learned how to exist in the gaps, how to lean into moments when the elevators slowed, when the lights flickered, when the building's attention wavered. I learned to be felt, he said, but not seen. Children sensed him first, always. They paused where adults rushed. They listened where adults dismissed. But children grew, and their awareness faded, replaced by the same armor of disbelief I had worn so comfortably for years. "What happens now?" I asked. He did not answer immediately. Instead, the space around us shifted, and I realized the elevator was moving again. Not up or down, but sideways, sliding through layers of darkness that felt thick and resistant, like wading through deep water. Images began to surface on the walls, flickering like projections on old film. I saw the building years earlier, cleaner, brighter. I saw the old man entering the elevator, pressing a button with a trembling hand. I saw the doors close, the sudden jolt, the lights going out. I saw him waiting. I turned away, unable to watch the rest. "This is what it means to be remembered," he said softly. "Not pity, not stories, just acknowledgement." The elevator stopped again, and this time the doors opened onto something almost familiar. A maintenance corridor, narrow and poorly lit, with exposed pipes and peeling paint. At the far end, a door stood ajar, light spilling through the gap. "You can leave," the old man said. Hope surged through me, sharp and painful. "And you?" He smiled, a tired, gentle expression that did not reach his eyes. "I will stay until someone else listens." I stepped toward the door, then hesitated, dread coiling in my stomach. "What about my son?" "Do you think you really know your neighbors?" My son made a friend in our building, but he was not on any resident list. He only appeared in the elevator for my son, and he knew things no one should ever know. And he was watching us. What I saw there shattered everything I believed in. In this video, you'll see stories that will make your blood run cold. Stories happening right under our noses, but we choose not to notice. Some moments are so disturbing and shameful that adults probably should not even know about them. And the ending of this story, you will never guess what happened to us and to the one who had been waiting in the elevator for years. Watch until the end, if you dare. "He will forget," the old man said. "Mostly. He will remember a feeling and not a face. That is how it always works." The thought both relieved and devastated me. I pushed the door open and stumbled into the corridor, my legs weak, my body heavy, as though gravity had suddenly doubled. Alarms were blaring now, sharp and insistent, echoing through the building. I heard voices, footsteps, the sound of tools clattering against metal. Someone shouted that the elevator had malfunctioned. I was found sitting on the floor near the maintenance area, pale and shaking, unable to explain how I had gotten there. They asked me questions I could not answer, wrapped me in a blanket, told me I was lucky. They said a man had gone missing in the building years ago, lost without a trace. They did not make the connection. Days passed, then weeks. The elevator was shut down for repairs, and we took the stairs, my son and I, step by careful step. He asked me once about the old man, frowning slightly, as though trying to remember a dream slipping away. "There was someone," he said. "Was not there?" I told him no. The lie tasted bitter, but it settled something in his eyes, smoothing the confusion, allowing him to move on. Life resumed its shape. Routine reclaimed us. The elevator was fixed, reopened, its walls polished, its lights brighter than before. People rode it without thinking, without noticing the faint chill that lingered just a second longer than it should. I noticed. Every time the doors closed, I felt it. The pause, the weight of waiting pressing in on me. Sometimes, when the elevator slowed unexpectedly, I caught my reflection in the metal and thought I saw someone standing just behind me, hunched and patient. I never turned around. Years later, when my son was almost grown, the elevator malfunctioned again. This time, people noticed immediately. Alarms sounded. The building was evacuated. News crews arrived. They spoke of safety inspections, of negligence, of how close it had all been to tragedy. No one died. That night, as I rode the stairs alone, I felt a strange mix of relief and anger twist inside me. It had worked. Someone had listened. When I finally allowed myself to take the elevator again, weeks later, it stopped briefly between floors. The lights flickered. The air grew cold. In the reflection, just for a moment, I saw the old man smile. Then the elevator moved on, leaving the space beside me empty at last. And for the first time, I was not sure whether I had saved myself or simply passed the waiting on to someone else.